Well, good morning, everybody. I am John O'Loughlin. Welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives, and we are now at McDuff Lives 1, McDuff Lives 3, and McDuff on Facebook. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks for your support on our Patreon, which you can find at screamingospreys.com. And thank you to all of you for being with me. Sorry for starting late today. Got a little busy. Hello to everyone. Barbara Kay says, did the Osprey fly? No, they didn't fly off. One of them sitting right back here behind me. Don't you see? That's Olivia back there. See her? Yeah, she's still here. And no, we've got a island full of them, really. So yeah, they're all over the place. And nice to have ospreys around. Also herons. We have great blue herons here, and they are, as you know, they're like prehistoric beasts with huge wingspans. Beautiful birds. It's a great joy to live here on the island, and glad you guys, some of you have been able to make it down, and we'll try to get another charrette lined up sometime if y'all are willing and get you back. Okay, this morning I just wanted to make some more progress in the book Treason in America by Aaron Burr, and I'm going to have to skip a couple chapters because while I am fascinated by the details of Aaron Burr's treachery, and also I think we've also learned a lot about Albert Gallatin and him being a Swiss agent, as well as Burr being a British and Swiss agent, that I'm going to skip a couple of chapters that give us more details about that and the various plots that were going on, but they're very much worth reading. The book is 600 pages long, so I just know I'm not going to read it all, but I do want to go to the next chapter, which is chapter 5, in which I'm very interested. I never really knew the details of what's called the Western plot or the details of the people involved. So I am going to go ahead and start with chapter 5 this morning. Just bear in mind the connections that we have already established between the Prevost, Malay Prevost family, the Gallatin family, the Hamilton family, and the numerous others that we've mentioned, all connected in a way to British money, British merchant families. And so we start with chapter 5. The murderer, which he refers to as Burr, marches west. And, okay. Among the pro-British merchant families who connived at the dismantling of the young American Republic were the Livingston clan of New York. Now, I'll stop here and just make a personal note. My entire life, I've lived along a highway that is called Indian Head Highway. It is Maryland Route 210, but it is really a um, paved and extended version of an older road called Livingston Road. And Livingston Road began in the District of Columbia and wound its way all the way down to Indian Head to the powder factory. But I don't know who Livingston was, and nobody I know knows who Livingston was. But clearly, this is an old family with a lot of money from with Scottish connections. So, and then of course there is a Livingstone who will be the subject of this chapter up in New York. So, but it's interesting. Now, of course, we just had a, a very um, interesting decision made by Prince George's County to rename Indian Head Highway to Piscataway Highway in honor of the local Indian tribe, and I think that's just fine too. But anyway, who was my Livingston? I don't know. Maybe I'll know someday before I die. Okay, the Scottish Livingstones, that's with an E on the end, were a rugged bunch. Edmund Burke told the story of Sir Alexander Livingstone, who was appointed in 1449 Justiciary of Scotland and ambassador to England. Livingstone asked an opponent, the Earl of Douglas, to sup at the royal table in the castle of Edinburgh. Since Livingstone was the guardian of the young King James II of Scotland, and the boy sovereign was to be present at the table, Douglas felt secure. After he was seated, servants brought in the freshly severed head of a black bull and placed it in front of him. The Earl tried to escape, but his brother, a friend, but he, his brother, and a friend were captured and beheaded. The fifth Lord Livingstone was one of the two guardians of Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. The grandson of the seventh Lord Livingston was one of two Scotsmen to negotiate with Charles II for his accession to the Scottish throne as well as the English. Later, the Livingstones revolted as Jacobites against the rule of William III and the later House of Hanover in favor of the continuing claim of the Stuarts. Now, here we are once again running into one of these historical splits that we're not taught in school. But if you don't understand the difference between a Jacobite and a Hanoverian, then you cannot understand how our country came to be and why certain areas of the country are different from others. And the whole idea of sovereignty is completely different, whether you are a Jacobite or a Hanoverian. The differences are just profound. And you look at Virginia and Kentucky and Tennessee and so much of the South founded by Jacobites. And how does that relate to the fact that now we have a debate between people who favor individual rights and would vote for Donald Trump over Biden versus the corporate faction that would vote for Biden? That this Jacobite versus Hanover is the beginning of that same division in our society. So the Livingstones revolted as Jacobites against the rule of William of Orange and later the House of Hanover, meaning, of course, the George I, II, and III, in favor of the continuing claim of the Stuarts. The clan was stripped of much of its power, titles, and lands, and retained little love for the reigning monarchs of England. The first Livingstone in America, son of a Scotsman exiled to Holland, dropped the final E from the final family name. This Robert Livingston set up a baronial estate north of Albany on the Hudson River. He continued the family's penchant for unusual forms of violence by convincing the English government to issue a commission to his protege, Captain William Kidd. The Livingston family of New York intermarried with the Smith family of New York and Canada, the Lee family of Virginia, and the Shippen family of Pennsylvania, provided both patriotic fighters to the cause of the American Revolution and others who played a bizarre part in the subversion of American independence. This group aided Aaron Burr's Treason, and they helped to restore a subterranean, growing British power in New York and America. The virtual coup d'etat carried out in 1782 to 83 by British intelligence overlord William Shelburne, by which Scottish political boss Henry Dundas and feudal theorist Adam Smith shared Shelburne's power in Britain, encouraged such exiled Scots to come back to the British fold. Robert Livingston had served on the committee of the Continental Congress, which drew up the Declaration of Independence. In 1783, the leader of the Masonic organization of the British Army in New York was Grand Master William Walter, who was soon to make a forced departure to the Tory exile station of Nova Scotia. See what we're talking about now? The British Army is full of Freemasons. Another thing you don't know, I mean, study Chris Fogarty's book about the British regiments all over Ireland that enforced the theft of their food and the genocide that resulted. These people are in Masonic lodges. In India, they're all in Masonic lodges. And the number of and effect of the power of these Masonic lodges has not been considered in written histories of the United States. And this is part of it right here, where you see the importance of him being, appointed Grand Master of an organization that started with the British Army. So it's the Masons. Walter arranged that the leadership of this Masonic organization, now no longer to be officially associated with the British Army, would be put in the hands of Robert Livingston. The latter was installed Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of New York by William Cock, Walter's temporary replacement, and on February 4th, 1784, just before Grand Master Cock also left with the departing British troops. From 1798 to 1800, Burr's law client John Jacob Astor was treasurer of the New York Grand Lodge. Whoa, did you know that? From 1801 to 1803, Robert Livingston's younger brother Edward, who was also mayor of New York and by virtue of Burr's designation, district attorney, served as deputy Grand Master. Burr's intimate friend and brother-in-law, Tapping Reeve of the Litchfield Law School, was busy enlisting recruits for the movement to separate New England from the Union. He wrote enthusiastically to Connecticut Senator Uriah Tracy that, quote, "All I have seen and most I have heard from believe that we must separate and that this is the time." Another Burr confidant, strategically situated in Boston and a friend to that city's bankers and politicians, was Burr's personal physician, William Eustace. The doctor entered politics after a good deal of prodding. In 1802, he defeated John Quincy Adams for Congress and sat in Washington beside his friend, the Vice President, Burr. As a conduit to the New England pro-British party, Eustace would be useful to Burr's organization a decade in the future when he would be the U.S. Secretary of War during the War of 1812. Colonel Charles Williamson of British Military Intelligence was relieved of his upstate New York assignment as manager of 1,000,000 acres of land on the frontier and moved into one of New York City houses of the new vice president, where he lived in 1801 and 1802. Okay, see, remember the connection from last week when we were talking about the British money being invested in huge tracts of New York rural land, and amounting to, if you look at the map, what must be close to a third of the state. I just recently saw another one of those maps that you see that say, here, look at this map, you'll see something astonishing. Well, they had a picture of the property owned by the wealthiest 100 families in the United States, and they had it all uh, lumped together so that the size of it fit over the state of Florida, so that 100 families own in the United States the size of the entire state of Florida. Well, that's pretty impressive. I guess Bill Gates has made a dent in that by now. He might own a substantial amount of our land. But, that's interesting, but it always does come back to who owns the land. So Williamson was up there managing land for Burr, whose clients are the pro-British that want to separate New England and New York away from the rest of the country. In other words, to divide and conquer. The following year, Williamson sailed back to London to confer with British Special Operations Chief Henry Dundas, Prime Minister Pitt, and others about the military activation of British agents in North America. Williamson's two responsibilities were Colonel Aaron Burr and General Francisco de Miranda, both of whom were to lead military expeditions on behalf of the British. Williamson returned to New York with a new British ambassador to the United States, Anthony Merry. They arrived at the same time, probably on the same boat. At a dinner meeting in Washington in early 1804, Senators Timothy Pickering and William Plummer of New Hampshire, and Senators James Hillhouse and Uriah Tracy, and Representative Roger Griswold of Connecticut spoke to Vice President Burr about their plans for secession. Senator Hillhouse told Burr at that meeting that the United States would soon form two distinct and separate governments, quote unquote. Henry Adams, the Anglophile historian of the early 19th century, wrote that the new British ambassador, quote, meddled and encouraged this and other plots against the American Union out of spite against President Jefferson. But the huge web of associations that Aaron Burr maintained with the British Swiss Secret Service organization, one part of which is shown on the chart on page 91, and I'll show that to you, must demonstrate to the impartial reader that Mr. Merry was no, quote, foolish diplomat. The death of Hamilton. Aaron Burr's New York organization had provided the margin of victory for the Democratic Republicans in the 1800 national elections, but Burr had been immediately isolated within the administration by President Jefferson, though never by Treasury Secretary Albert Gallatin, and he was to be dropped from the re-election ticket in 1804. Burr's place as vice president was to be taken by New York's governor, George Clinton. The plan of the pro-British party was now to elect Aaron Burr as governor of New York, where he was to lead that state and possibly New Jersey and Pennsylvania out of the Union, along with otherwise weak New England states. Again, Alexander Hamilton plunged in with passionate intensity at the crucial moment, denouncing Burr. And though his own Federalist Party endorsed Burr for governor, Hamilton called for the election of his Republican opponent. By pulling out all the stops, Hamilton managed to disturb enough otherwise sleepy people that Burr was soundly defeated. The plain fact was that Burr could accomplish little to the detriment of the United States, and from this point on, if Alexander Hamilton remained alive. So, Burr killed him. Why Hamilton went along with the duel proposed by Burr, whether to accommodate popular prejudices, as Hamilton's last writings indicate, or as a deliberate self-sacrifice calculated to end Burr's career, or as a blind action based on Burr's manipulation of some weakness in Hamilton's character, or whether Hamilton really intended to win the duel had his gun not misfired, as some historians claim, may never be known. The fact remains, however, that Aaron Burr killed Alexander Hamilton, the founder of the independent economic system of the United States, and deliberately killing another person was then, as now, against the law, whether in a duel or otherwise. Burr should rightfully have been punished for murder. Hamilton was shot on July 11th, 1804, and died the following day. On July 20th, 1804, while Burr awaited the coroner's findings, John Jacob Astor made available $41,783. The following morning, Burr fled New York. During the period 1803 to 1805, Astor, quote, expended in purchases from Burr a little over $116,000. In return, Burr transferred to Astor title to very valuable Manhattan real estate, which was not Burr's property. Burr now proceeded to Philadelphia, where he conferred with Colonel Charles Williamson of British intelligence. Williamson was Burr's law client, his partner in the New York State legislature, and key agent in New York State since 1792. After the Burr-Williamson conference, the following letter was sent by the proud British ambassador Anthony Merry to his home office in London. It was fished out of the British archives later on in the 19th century by historian Henry Adams. Quote, now this is Ambassador Anthony Merry, the British, writing to his home office in London. Quote, I have just received an offer from Mr. Burr, the actual Vice President of the United States, to lend his assistance to His Majesty's government in any matter in which they may think fit to employ him, particularly in endeavoring to effect a separation of the western part of the United States from that which lies between the Atlantic and mountains in its whole extent. His proposition on this and other subjects will be fully detailed to your lordship by Colonel Williamson, who has been the bearer of them to me, and who will embark for England in a few days. The letter is dated August 4th, 1804, less than a month after the killing of Hamilton. Burr was by this time under indictment in New York and New Jersey, but already the Burr organization was plastering over the skeleton in the closet. Morgan Lewis, governor of New York and brother-in-law of Robert and Edward Livingston, denounced the indictment of Burr as disgraceful, illiberal, and ungentlemanly. The Burr legal and public relations machine succeeded in reducing the New York State murder charge to a misdemeanor. The New Jersey murder indictment stood. Burr traveled surreptitiously southward. He received a warm reception and had a lively set of conferences with his son-in-law, Joseph Alston, owner of possibly the largest plantation in South Carolina, with Senator Pierce Butler, Burr's close friend, who had threatened a dissolution of the Union in the first Congress on June 11th, 1789, and with other, quote, forefathers of the Confederacy. Returning now to Washington, Aaron Burr resumed his chair in the Senate as presiding officer as vice president. Legally, he could not be touched. He had immunity from state-level prosecutions as long as he was vice president and on federal territory. Politically, the hand of the administration was extended to him in the person of Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin. Burr's Swiss cousin Gallatin met repeatedly with the fugitive vice president while writing that, quote, the unquenchable hatred of Burr and federal policy have combined in producing an artificial sensation much beyond what might have been expected, and a majority of both parties seem disposed to deify Hamilton and to treat Burr as a murderer. The duel for a duel was certainly fair. Jefferson was convinced that Burr's services were yet needed and could be used as presiding officer in the Senate. An impeachment trial was pending in that body for Federalist Judge Samuel Chase, one of the judicial officers Jefferson wanted to purge to clear the decks for his own party. With Albert Gallatin's timely advice, the president gave Burr 3 appointments, which would supposedly secure Burr's aid against Judge Chase. 1. General James Wilkinson, Burr's collaborator since the Conway cabal against George Washington, and now the highest-ranking U.S. officer since the death of General Alexander Hamilton, was made governor of Upper Louisiana Territory. John Bartow Prevost, Burr's stepson and a Swiss oligarchical assassin by heredity and association, was made judge of the Territorial Superior Court at New Orleans. James Brown, brother-in-law of Burr's deceased wife, the Browns and the Burrs had been married in a double wedding ceremony, was made Secretary of the Upper Louisiana Territory. Burr's Louisiana appointees joined an entire Burr organization that had been accumulating in that region since it had left Spanish jurisdiction. Napoleon Bonaparte had thrown a monkey wrench into British plans for taking over the Western Hemisphere in 1803. He had obtained the entire middle area of North America from the Spanish, the Louisiana Territory, stretching from the present state of Louisiana in a broad triangle up to the Canadian border. He had then sold the entire territory to the United States, which had been hoping to obtain only a small piece. As a result, the job of the British agents had become more complicated. Attacking and conquering Louisiana would now mean attacking the United States. James Workman, author of the British government memorandum on the conquest of the Western Hemisphere, left Charleston, South Carolina, and traveled to New Orleans, where he managed to have himself appointed judge of New Orleans County. Edward Livingston, New York's mayor and district attorney and confederate of Burr and Gallatin, quit his posts, accepted $12,000 from John Jacob Astor, and went to start a new life in Louisiana. Judge Workman and Edward Livingston became the leaders of an organization known as the Mexican Association. The group's program was explained to new recruits by Workman and his Irish immigrant operatives, as reported in Thomas P. Abernethy's exhaustive book, The Burr Conspiracy. Quote, Baton Rouge was to be seized. The Mexican standard was then to be raised. Troops collected and a British naval force from New Providence in the Bahamas assembled on Lake Pontchartrain. Arms were to be sent up to Fort Adams, a post that might be captured to serve as a base of operations. After the capture of Baton Rouge, the money in the banks and the shipping in the river at New Orleans were to be seized in order to organize an expedition to join Miranda by way of Mexico. Miranda being the officer that was mentioned at the beginning of the chapter as one of the charges of the British spy chiefs, the other being Burr. The conspiracy to attack and seize the U.S. territory of Louisiana and to set up as large as possible Western buffer state under British protection was the operative version of the British plan of 1800, committed to writing by James Workman. The French minister in Washington, Louis-Marie Turgot, wrote home to Foreign Minister Talleyrand, quote, Louisiana is thus going to be the seat of Mr. Burr's new intrigues. He is going there under the aegis of General Wilkinson. It is even asserted that he might find the means there already prepared by a certain Livingston from New York City, and who is closely associated with Burr. Burr was not shy about obtaining aid from men and women of the cloth. In the words of Burr's executor, Matthew Davis, quote, the Catholic bishop, resident at New Orleans, was also consulted and prepared to promote the enterprise. He designated 3 priests of the order of Jesuits as suitable agents, and they were accordingly employed. Madame Xavier Tarchon, superior of the convent of Ursuline nuns at New Orleans, was in the secret. Some of the sisterhood were also employed in Mexico. Well, this is one of the overarching themes that I've seen in my work, and that is that you have these people who are like Livingston, powerfully connected to the Freemasons, and yet their plot is agreeable and in fact joined in by the Jesuits. The Jesuits are controlling Louisiana, but they'd rather have the British rule it than Americans. Why is that? Well, apparently the Jesuits and the British Freemasons have got a lot in common that you don't read about in the history books. Aaron Burr spent the years 1804 to 1806 preparing to lead combinations of American mercenaries and British naval forces in action, commencing in the Midwest and proceeding through New Orleans. Tons of paper have been wasted, anguished, millions of words have been strewn onto pages speculating as to Aaron Burr's intentions. Since Burr had no values or commitments in the ordinary sense, it is of far greater use to ascertain, as we have done, the intentions of his London patrons and employers. We have provided herein, for the first time since these events took place, the lines of association between Burr, his partner and cousin Gallatin, and the British Secret Service organization. Any other approach to the Burr Western conspiracy runs into the problem of having to piece through evidence that was destroyed or tampered with by the participants and later reported on by historians whose sympathies for British American, quote, reassociation should cast doubt on their zeal for digging into this matter. We will cite here only those facts among a mountain of available data which shed light on crucial future historical developments which serve to round out the picture of the main protagonists of this history. William Eaton, an American diplomat who had helped in the fight against the Barbary pirates, testified at Burr's 1807 trial, quote, Mr. Burr inquired of me what officers of the Marine Corps and of the Navy with which I was acquainted. I told him with most of them. It is impossible for me to remember distinctly every adverb expressed to me in the course of conversation, but this I perfectly recollect, that if he could gain the Marine Corps and secure to his interest the naval commanders Truxton, Preble, and Decatur, he would turn Congress neck and heels out of doors, assassinate the president, or what amounted to that, and declare himself the protector of an energetic government. If that distinct expression was not used, parentheses, though the impression is distinct in my mind that it was used in the course of conversation, yet he used such expressions as these, quote, hang him, throw him in the Potomac, send him to Carter's Mountain. He said the blow must be struck, and if he struck it at that time and place, he would be supported by the best blood of America, unquote. Yeah. Well, we only want the best blood, right? One of Burr's assistants on the Western Project was eventually promoted for the presidency of the United States under Burr's and Livingston's guidance. Andrew Jackson, Burr's friend from the Senate days, had provided Burr with hospitality, praise, recruits, including his own nephew, and the boats with which to transport the mercenary army Burr was assembling down the Ohio River. The collapse of the conspiracy seems to have been caused by the habit, parentheses intensely annoying to feudal oligarchs and their employees, close parentheses, of ordinary American citizens to speak out when they suspect that something is being done against the interests of their country. Among these was Joseph Hamilton Davis, district attorney for Kentucky, who wrote to President Jefferson outlining the secession plot and asking for the dispatch of investigators. Eventually, General Wilkinson decided to turn against Burr, apparently to save himself. He declared martial law in New Orleans and arrested Burr and several co-conspirators. Judge James Workman, described only as, quote, an Englishman of 3 years' residence in the Abernathy account, released Burr and his associates and began attacking Wilkinson as a liar. But Burr was rearrested, along with Workman and several other eligible characters. One of those taken and sent in chains to Washington was Dr. Justus Eric Bowman, Burr's go-between for European arms and financing, who had previously been employed by Jacques Necker's daughter, Madame de Staël, in smuggling operations with revolutionary France. Edward Livingston, who had been installed as Grand Master of the Louisiana Masonic Lodge as soon as he arrived there, was in sufficient command of the affairs of the legal community to have all charges against himself dropped. All the main conspirators managed to get off as well. Burr's treason trial in Richmond, Virginia, was presided over by Supreme Court Justice John Marshall. Burr was acquitted, as the jury said, on the basis of the evidence which they were presented. They insisted on that explicit verdict despite protests from Burr's attorneys. In fact, the crucial evidence by which all historians today judge Burr's activities, such as the letter of British Ambassador Mary, was not available for consideration at that trial. Witness Andrew Jackson, who was not himself charged because he had earlier warned of Burr's designs, denounced the president for oppressing Burr. And Albert Gallatin's old friend, Paul Henry Mallet Prevost, Burr's cousin, swore that he wasn't involved in the plot and had refused to take part. When he left the scene of the trial, Burr was a hated and hunted man. He was wanted by mobs to be lynched. He was wanted by several states on charges including treason. Burr made his way to New York in disguise. After receiving tens of thousands of dollars in cash advances for his house from John Jacob Astor, he fled the country, June 7, 1808, on a ship bound for Nova Scotia. The British governor of Nova Scotia was Sir George Prevost, Burr's nephew by marriage, who was soon to be Governor General of Canada. Prevost welcomed Burr effusively and gave him a royal send-off to England with a letter of introduction to the British Secretary of War, Lord Castlereagh. When Aaron Burr arrived in England, he swore to customs officials that he was, quote, born within the king's allegiance and his parents' British subjects, unquote. His purpose in coming to England, quote, I am personally known to Lord Mulgrave and Prime Minister Canning, to whom the motives for my visit have been declared. These reasons have long been known to Lord Melville, who was the Special Operations Chief, his purpose in coming to England. These reasons have long been known to Lord Melville, who is Special Operations Chief Henry Dundas. While in Britain, Burr divided his time between visits with his Mallet Prevost relatives, with Jeremy Bentham, who gave Burr the entire use of his London house and servants, and with the Scottish nobility, who, under the leadership of Shelburne and Dundas, had poured the plague of opium upon Asia. Now, isn't that, that's just one sentence, but it speaks, of, hundreds of years of misery that came out of this relationship between the old Scottish nobility, who are now given kind of the right or the license to run the opium trade for the British Empire. And that's how, that's how they became servitors, in Professor Hamamoto's great words. So these Scottish lords, like Sinclair, you know, yeah, that's Sinclair, the ones that, you know, become the Trudeaus and the Sinclair broadcasting networks and all of that, all that money comes from opium, and it's a lot of money. So perhaps it is fitting, while visiting his applauding patrons among the Jardines, the Hopes, and the Ogilvies, Burr was himself becoming addicted to opium. The diary Burr kept during the 4 years of his European exile is enlightening from several standpoints. It contains the record of Burr's day-to-day relations with the British and continental noble families, whose hostility to the existence of the United States makes the document embarrassing to apologists for Burr. Its pornographic banality, endless details of Burr's relations with prostitutes, prices, quality, etc., is shocking, considering the diary was written to be shown to his daughter Theodosia. More importantly, the character of the man and his relations, when compared to that displayed in other men's diaries of the time, such as John Quincy Adams's splendid 12-volume record, places Burr's apologists in a ridiculous light. It is quite understandable, though not excusable, that the diary of Aaron Burr would have found its way into the hands of New York Times founder Henry Raymond to be suppressed by his family until 1903. And that concludes chapter 5 of Treason in America, from Aaron Burr to Averell Harriman. I suppose, like you, I'm a little anxious to get to the Averell Harriman part, but it's going to probably be a couple of weeks before we get there. And in the meantime, I can't emphasize enough how important it is for us to understand the Scottish, the Swiss, and the difference between the Hanoverian and the Jacobites. And which side, by the way, would you put George Washington on, the Jacobites or the Hanoverians? It's a thought question, isn't it? So what if Napoleon, you know, sold Louisiana to America, not because he wanted the money, but because he knew that if he didn't, then Great Britain would take Louisiana because he couldn't defend it. And if Great Britain, with the help of Aaron Burr and the Livingston family and the Scottish nobility that were now starting to get extremely rich from the opium trade, if they all went together and did as the British Secret Service wanted them to do, Lord Shelburne, Lord Melville, and General or Colonel Williamson, whichever, apologize which one it was, Williamson, I think. If they hadn't been confronted with the sale of Francis, Louisiana to Jefferson's United States, then they would have had there wouldn't be anything to stop them from having taken the Mississippi River all the way down to Louisiana, and then to develop that as part of the British Empire, gradually strangling the hopes of the United States to become a powerful and wealthy nation on its own. It's an awesome omission from history that we are not told about these treasonous plots against our Constitution and against our Declaration of Independence and against our freedom. Why? Well, because the war's not over. They're still in our pockets. They're still in our government. They still have their tentacles. It's still a open question of whether, you know, this nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. All right. Thanks, everybody. I will see you tomorrow with a minefield at 11 a.m. And y'all take care. Wonderful research going on in so many people's work now with Mark Kulak at Housatonic Live and David Underdown on Twitter. Bill Taylor's reporting on Twitter and at his blog at Deep State Analytics. Harley Schlanger and the Schiller Institute. Um, Meg Mundy's very nice email blasts, and so many other sources that we have. I appreciate everybody's work. We all do what we can, and somehow I think that little mention in the book about the character of the ordinary American will rise up and object and make it stop, like they did the Western conspiracy of Aaron Burr. Get up, stand up, don't give up your rights. We can do this.